All right, so starting off a little bit, sort of lean over in a different direction, we're going to talk a smidge about the difference between achievement and aptitude tests, and then we're going to go in a very different direction and talk about genetic components versus environmental components that might be influencing intelligence. So starting with these different sort of psychometric standards, we've talked about the idea of psychometrics just being that field where we have lots and lots of data, we've made a lot of measurements, and we'd like to make some determination from those measures. And we've, I think, mentioned that we can have either achievement tests, like when we're looking at performance in, say, a class. So a midterm would be a good idea of an achievement test because it's designed to discover how much someone knows. How well have you met the criteria set out by this particular course? Whereas an aptitude test might actually be a little bit closer to the concept that most people have started to think about when it comes to intelligence, where it's instead of what have you memorized or what have you sort of learned in this specific situation, could we actually measure potential for future learning and future performance? So could we look at, say, a set of questions where if you score really highly, that tells us that you are likely to succeed in this particular area in the future? A really common aptitude test, especially in psychology, is actually called the GRE. I never remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a standardized test that's often taken when people are looking to get into graduate level programs. It isn't specific to psychology. There are different modules and different subtests that you can take, but the general version is sometimes required by different universities, though we'll come back to that. But the way that this works is it's not quite an intelligence test. There are some logic and reasoning puzzles. There's a mathematics component. There's a pattern recognition component. There's a read and respond component. And from all of these, they're going to print out sort of a series of different scores that say, here's how you did solving these types of problems. And there's a leaning into, instead of, do you have this general knowledge, but could you solve a novel problem? Or could you think in this new way that we've designed for this test? I think there are subsections where they do test general knowledge, but we're focusing on the general component. And then what they do is say, okay, well, a high score should be an indication of success in your grad school. The problem here being, and that thing I'm swinging back to, is that in practice, the GRE pretty much doesn't correlate with success in grad school. So even though it's been held up as a standard and is often required to get into different programs, follow-up studies have shown that you can score really high on this test and end up dropping out of your program. You can score really low on this test and end up doing really, really well. This was an interesting one. I was kind of middle of the road on this test. I didn't know that it existed because it's not a thing for biology. And some people study for certain components. But I ended up finishing my degrees, both of them. So maybe not necessarily an indicator. But because of this lack of correlation, we've ended up seeing that a lot of universities are moving to make this either optional or no longer required. So it might depend on the supervisor or the individual departments, but it's not a blanket requirement anymore. So it's kind of neat to see that they thought that it was a great aptitude test. They thought it was this great indicator of success in the future, but it ended up not really being helpful in any predictive way, shape, or form. All right, so with that little bit of a tangent and that distinction between our two types of tests, this section here gets into that nature versus nurture discussion. And by now we should have established that it's not so much the debate that it's usually presented as. It's not it has to be one or the other. Instead, we're typically looking at what are the relative contributions of both. So the nature component would be something to do with our genes, some innate component of our biology that's going to be there because of the instructions within our genetic code. So if we talk about certain things having some kind of evolutionary influence, if we say that something has been affected by natural selection, for that to occur, there has to be some genetic component. Because as a refresher, with natural selection, that pressure is going to be acting on our displayed traits. So something like our personality might be something that is selected for, but it only gets passed on to the future generation if there are some genes that influence your personality. Otherwise, your children, you might have had a beneficial personality, but they might have no benefit, and then there would be no selective pressure there. So when we talk about these innate characteristics, we're just saying there has to be some component where genes are influencing what we end up seeing. And then those genes, that starting point, those are going to be modulated by different factors within our environments. And technically, our environment could be sort of any force outside of our genes. It could be stuff going on within our bodies. So you could talk about even the uterine environment. So while you're growing and developing, which will be relevant for heredity and stuff here, but you might be exposed to certain chemicals or high levels or low levels of nutrients that might, in the long run, end up affecting how your brain makes connections or something like that. That would still count as an environmental force. We can also look more externally to things like schooling environment or home environment, parenting techniques, and things like that. So these are very catch-all terms. And I usually stress a couple of times during the semester that when we talk about a genetic component, we are almost never going to be talking about a specific gene, because while we might see that there is some heritability where you might inherit a trait, you're similar to your parents in that trait, so there is some genetic component, we're rarely able to point to a single gene and say this is what's causing that similarity. Even when we're able to do genetic analyses, it's very hard to point to one place. So very broad strokes here for our overall message. But yeah, so that was a bunch of remember some of this information, here's some background. However, let's apply it specifically to intelligence now. And so we're saying that intelligence is going to come from both our innate characteristics, that stuff that we're born with, as well as some unique experience from stuff in our environment. And with this situation, we can look at what are our relative contributions from each. Is this going to be more influenced by our genes, or is it more influenced by our environment? And it kind of depends on the scenario. So I suppose as our reminder, we've talked a little bit about historical points where there was this discussion of the potential for inheritance and they didn't know it was genes at the time, but inheriting some traits from our parents. But if we go all the way back to Plato in almost 400 BCE, they suggested that people would be born with some innate aptitude. So we have this capacity to be sort of this smart or that smart, but specifically looking at not so much general intelligence, but more you would be well suited to this particular trade or this particular career because you'd have the knowledge or the ability to learn the knowledge required for that particular area. So you might have been born to a carpenter, and therefore you would also be predisposed to become a good carpenter yourself. So a little bit vague still, but yeah, that idea of inheritance. We of course mentioned that Galton had that very strong focus on inherited components, saying that certain families would be predisposed to be more intelligent than other families, and all of the undertones that that entailed. So this isn't necessarily a new idea. But modern studies have said, okay, well, can we do some tests? Can we actually run and see, instead of just vague suppositions and anecdotal evidence, could we quantify what's being driven by genes and what's being driven by environments? Absolutely. And so there's a couple of concepts that we're going to need to know to get started with this. The first is our concept of genetic relatedness. And so this just means that the closer you are genetically to certain relatives, the more genes you're sharing. So you are more similar to your parents than you would be to your grandparents. And you are going to be equally similar to your parents as to your siblings. And I can double check. Actually, this is a really good diagram to show some of this shared genetic material. I am hopping a little bit, but mainly because this is a nice visual to have here. I will go back for sure. But this is just showing, so parents and their biological child would share 50% of their genes. So when we talk about inheriting genetic material, you get half of your DNA from your mother and half from your father, so you are 50% sharing genes with either of them. And then if we look at it, your sibling is going to inherit half from one parent and half from the other. And if you work out the probability of that, you end up probably sharing about 25% of your maternal DNA with a sibling and 25% of your paternal DNA with your sibling, meaning that you and your sibling share overall 50% of your genes. So yeah, that's down here, our biological siblings. We then get a special case that's really, really important for our way of investigating the relative contributions of genes and environment, and these are the fact that there's two types of twins. And we, again, may or may not have mentioned this in previous chapters because it becomes relevant every time we talk about inheritance, but when we have identical twins, these are also called monozygotic twins. They are formed from a single fertilized egg that through some sort of fluke during the early division process, they're going to separate out into two smaller clusters of cells, but because they started from the same cell, the same single fertilized egg, they're going to have exactly the same genes. So their genetic material overlaps 100%. And then they'll go through gestation, and then they're born and have all their genes the same, but they might differ in the environmental experiences they have. Our other types of twins are these fraternal twins. And fraternal twins are sometimes called dizygotic twins. So you might see the pattern. If a monozygotic twin comes from a single fertilized egg, dizygotic twins should come from two separately fertilized eggs. Once again, a little bit of a fluke, but here the mother would release two eggs at the same time, and they'd both be fertilized separately. So in this situation, we have effectively normal siblings who happen to be born at the same time. So instead of sharing 100% of their genes, our fraternal twins only share 50% of their genes. Same logic as what we used for our biological siblings down at the bottom here. And so if we can look at these two different types of twins, where some of them share more genes than others, we could actually look at how similar our sets of twins are for a particular trait. So since we're in the intelligence chapter, we'd look at the IQ of our twins. So if twin A is an identical twin to twin B, and twin A has a very high IQ, what do we typically see for twin B? If there is a genetic component, we should see that twin B's score should be fairly similar to twin A. Whereas if we looked at, say, our fraternal twins, because they share less genes, we would expect them to be less similar to one another as compared to our identical twins if there is a genetic component. And I'm just double checking. I do have a visual that let me double check. Sometimes I find it's a little bit easier to just draw this diagram, which I think I'm going to do for you guys. So if we find a little bit of a blank corner here, we'll just tuck it into the side. So if we have our graph, and we're going to say, all right, we have our monozygotic twins, our identical twins. And if we look at twin A's score and twin B's score, maybe we're going to get a correlation. And so if twin A scores really low, twin B also scores really low. And if twin A scores really high, twin B scores really high. So maybe look something like this as our refresher of correlations. So strong-ish positive correlation tells us that they're pretty similar to one another. If we then looked at our dizygotic twins, and we still see that there's a positive correlation, but maybe our data points are much more spread out. So they're not as similar as our monozygotic twins, as our identical twins. So having less genes in common seems to be related to them having less similarities in their IQs. So that gives us our first hint that we're probably looking at some genetic component here. But, of course, that doesn't necessarily help us determine the difference between environmental versus genetic components here. So the second part that we can do here is to use our adoption studies. And you can do both together, which is usually the best. But with adoption, we are going to have people who are either not adopted, they live together in the same environment, or they are adopted, and therefore they would be living apart in different environments. And so if it's all genes, then we would say that whether our identical twins are living together or not, if everything's influenced by our genetics, well, our together twins should be pretty much the same in terms of patterns as what we'd see with the adopted twins. Having a different environment might not have an effect if it's all genetic. However, if we look at the numbers that we get here, so shared environment is that environmental component, shared genes is that genetic component. The identical twins always share 100% of their genes. Shared environment, yes, meaning that they have same environmental forces, same genetic forces. They have a really, really high correlation. So that's telling us, yes, there's probably some genetic component here. And when we look at identical twins raised apart, not in a shared environment, we see that this number is smaller than that number. So being in different environments makes these twin pairs less similar. So sharing an environment makes them more similar. Being in different environments makes them less similar. So there's also an environmental component here as well. So the question being, if they're sharing the same environment and same genes, why isn't it like a perfect correlation? And the reason for that is when they're calculating these numbers, so if you actually go behind the scenes to how they work this out, there's always some error term. There's always some potential for something else. So in some situations, you'll actually call it an unshared environment. So if you look at it and you have identical twins, but one of them plays hockey and the other plays football, all of a sudden there's a difference. If their friend groups are slightly different. Even something as simple as one has one, I already used the sports example. I'm immediately going to forget. But yeah, so you can have very small differences, and those small differences can end up having a pretty large effect. The other thing is that we can have things like interactions with some of those small differences. So while we do call it an unshared environment term, in practicality, it's effectively an error term. So it's whatever's left over that we can't explain using these two components. But yeah, you can go in and actually do calculations to get relative contributions with numbers, but we go with the simple form. And you'll notice that, like, if we think about these numbers when we get into things like personality, these correlations are very, very high. When we look at things like personality, a pretty strong correlation coefficient is going to be something in the range of, say, 0.2 or 0.3, which is still saying, yeah, there's a little bit of a genetic influence, but the environment has a much, much larger impact here. And so that's the logic with our identical twins, but we can also introduce our fraternal twins to give us a little bit of extra info as well. I would have preferred if we had fraternal twins in a shared environment versus an unshared environment, so we could have all 4 bars or all 4 numbers here to consider, but we can make up our own momentarily. But if we're saying, okay, so the fraternal twins are sharing an environment but half their genes, compared to our identical twins sharing an environment with all of their genes shared, and we look at that difference in those 2 numbers, that's a much, much larger difference. So that tells us that there is for sure that genetic component as well. So we want to look at both shared versus unshared environment in our 2 types of twins to look at the differences in amount of genetic similarities, and then we can tell that there are contributions from both of those components. But if we continue down this list, you can end up with different correlations here, looking at a parent and their biological child if they're in the same environment, and we start seeing that these get much, much smaller, much, much quicker. A parent and their biological child, if they don't share an environment, this is where you'd be looking at a child who is adopted out, usually fairly young, and we want to see if they are still similar to their parents, even if their environment is very different, even if they're raised apart from those parents. And here we see a pretty large drop-off, which tells us that even though that genetic component is the same between these 2, that different environment still plays a pretty large role. And we can't look at these numbers and say, aha, it's exactly half, therefore it means this specific thing. This is more of a, we're looking at relative patterns to make that interpretation. If you went on and took, say, a behavioral genetics course, you could break this down and calculate stuff. Not our thing. One other, let me find my mouse here. So one other consideration, because if you're looking at diagrams like this, it might not be very helpful to just squint at a whole bunch of these correlation coefficients and make sense of it all. So sometimes you'll end up seeing graphs that'll look something like this, where we would say that maybe our pink bars are going to be adopted or separate environments, and then we'll eventually put in some blue bars where they're raised in the same environments, and then we'd have our identical twins versus our fraternal twins. And so our correlation coefficients, so we have our R's, nice squiggles with mouse drawings, but if we're saying, okay, identical twins who are raised apart are going to have this much of a correlation coefficient, and fraternal twins raised apart would be somewhere like that. So we know that the fraternal twins are less similar because of that genetic component. And then if we switch over our colors and we get some blues here, and these are going to be raised together, then we'd say that our identical twins raised together are going to be more similar, and our fraternal twins raised together would be more similar. So these aren't going to be to scale or anything like that. It's just me looking at this. And so I'd say, okay, if our within our twin types, the apart versus together is different, if being raised apart is smaller correlation coefficients, less similarity, then that's telling us that there is an effect of environment. We see the same pattern over here, where even when we have fewer genes in common, being raised apart is going to give us less similarity than being raised together. So both of those tell us there is an environmental component. And then if we look at our identical twins overall versus our fraternal twins overall, if these are showing higher scores, the identical twins showing higher scores, and the fraternal twins showing lower scores overall, that then also tells us that there is a genetic component. So these are the sorts of patterns that we'd be watching for and how we'd interpret that information about how similar or different they are. And we're going to see some very similar patterns of inheritance when we look at other types of correlations or correlation coefficients for things like personality and so on and so forth. And in fact, even before I go back, we can look at some of these. These are twin studies where we have our identical twins versus fraternal twins. They didn't do raised together or raised apart, but they're showing that comparison between twins who share all their genes versus half their genes for a whole bunch of different diseases and disorders here. And so in pretty much all of these cases, we're seeing larger bars for our identical twins and smaller bars for our fraternal twins, telling us that in almost all of these cases, we are going to be seeing some genetic component. We have a couple in here where the patterns are either really small or, in this one case, very, very small and almost the other direction. But with our lack of error bars, we're not making any conclusions. These ones would tell us that there probably isn't as much of a genetic component. There's probably more of an environmental component, at least from this one study. This is meant more as a, you don't have to know these numbers, but more of when we look at these bar graphs, what is it that we're interpreting? What's the logic for what information we're getting here? And I will mention, just in case you're wondering, having looked at the axes, this is listing twin concordance instead of our correlation coefficients. This is just a very similar score, and what it says here, because we're looking at, do you have this disorder, yes or no? We're saying if twin A has the disorder, how likely is twin B to have that disorder too? So that would be our concordance, is their likelihood of both having a disorder. Whereas when we were looking at IQs, those are more of a range of numbers. So it's not saying, do you have this IQ, yes or no? It's saying if this twin has this kind of score, what's the score the other one has? Just a little bit of a statistics and logic thing in the background. But all we care about is that larger bars means more similar and shorter bars means less similar, and we're more curious about the relationships between the two. Okay, so that was a little bit of a detour, having hopped ahead to some of these ideas there, but I suppose I could even come all the way back here, because I explained this component of nature versus nurture, genes versus environment, but we have a visual here that could allow us to understand a more abstract concept of like those twin studies. But here we're looking at, instead of people, they're using corn, which is a decent stand-in. When we work with plants, plants are pretty easy because you can have identical genetic components. We're not going to be able to study behavior or anything, but that's fine in this situation. It's just an example. And so here we're saying, okay, if we have corn that's come off of the same cob, therefore they're going to have the exact same genes, and we're going to put them in different environments, what kinds of variation do we now see? And here they're saying, okay, well, if our environment is really poor or our environment is really rich, what kinds of patterns are we observing here? And so if we have differences between the poor environment versus the rich environment with identical genes, then we're saying that there must be some influence of that environment. The soil and the quality of the soil played a role. And we could flip that on its head, where if we raised different genetically different corn plants in the same soil, in that case, it's like sharing an environment, and the differences would be because of those genetic differences. So just another way to try and visualize those comparisons if people and something kind of abstract like IQ wasn't quite doing it for you. And we've been using some of these terms already without having proper definitions for them. It usually occurs to me to add in one of these definition slides, but I occasionally get ahead of myself. But we've talked about natural selection a bunch so far, and we're saying that the natural selection is where we have people or other organisms who have genes that give them some kind of benefit, some kind of adaptive quality, where they succeed in the environment that they're in. They end up being more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce, which means that they're going to pass on the genes that ended up contributing to those traits that made them successful. And so if that future population, because of natural selection, has more and more and more individuals with those traits, then we would see a shift in that population having more and more of this trait present. And so that process of changing a trait within a population, that's where we get evolution. So it's that change in those traits over time, and it's driven by natural selection. Another one of our concepts to talk about here is heritability. And this is an oversimplified definition, which I kind of want to adjust a little bit verbally with you here. But heritability is a score that we can report that's going to tell us out of all of the variation that we have within our population, how much of that has been caused by our genetic factors. So if we take this classroom as our population, and we're going to look at height, because as per usual, I find more concrete physically measurable things than less abstract concepts easier to visualize. But if we look at height and we have people from tallest to shortest, there is a variation, there's a range there in our different heights. So of that difference that we've observed, how much of that has been caused by genetic differences? And the rest would assumedly be driven by environmental differences. And so when we report this number, we're not necessarily saying, hey, how much of your height is determined by genes. We're saying how much in our observed differences in height can be attributed to genes. It's a very slight sort of adjustment, and I find the extra words help add to the definition on the slide here. And we can stress a couple of limitations. Because we're not making a blanket claim about this much of your height is determined by genes, we're more looking at that variation within our population. If we look at a different population, we can sometimes find that this heritability score changes. So with intelligence, we typically get sort of a single score. And that's because there tends to be some pretty decent consistency across populations and across studies. Whereas when we start looking at personality, some of our heritability scores are actually going to end up being ranges. And that's because different studies will have very different scores that they output, meaning that being in a different population gives us a slightly different answer. So when we start seeing that later on, it's just one of those technicalities that comes from exactly what this trait is measuring. It's also one of the reasons why we typically end up reporting our correlations instead of just a heritability coefficient. They're interpreted very, very similar, but this one has a slightly different interpretation. Overall, for this course, we're really still looking at that pattern of is there a genetic factor, or is there an environmental factor, or is there both? But again, we're setting some groundwork because these are concepts that will come up if you continue taking psych classes. All right, so now we can go back to where we were. And we've kind of discussed this from a question, which was saying, okay, we've been talking about this shared environment as our sort of non-genetic component. However, what else is going on? And that's our non-shared environment, or like I was describing it, more like an error term. This is the stuff that can't be explained by being in the same environment, by being in the same household or having the same parents or going to the same school. This would be all the other stuff, the small things that might differ between twins. And so we can consider both of these. So even though we're reporting just one number that gives us that indication, you could, like I said, if you calculated stuff out, you can break down into genetic components, shared environmental components, and unshared environmental components, just to sort of pick it apart a little bit more, but we won't be doing that here. All right. Okay, so with our discussion of that whole genetic component, we do, I guess, have some caveats because we would be cautious, having seen how Galton had taken that there is a genetic component and run with it. We usually stress with all sorts of things that have genetic components that genes are not deterministic. I instead would rather think about genes as something that sets a range of possible scores. And then our environment is going to be something that tells us where within that range we're going to fall. So if you have a range between these values and you're in an enriched environment, you're going to end up hopefully towards the upper end of that particular range. Whereas if you're in a deprived environment without enrichment, you'd end up on the lower end of your range. There can be sort of more intense influences depending on which type of trait we're looking at. And again, we're looking at for intelligence as you can score sort of anywhere in a particular range. But when we start applying the same concepts to things like with our graph there, looking at specific disorders of do you develop it or do you not develop it, we would look at more, instead of a specific score, what are your likelihood or what is your odds of developing this particular disorder. It has to stay probabilistic though, because we're never going to know for sure. And that ties into the idea that genes are still not deterministic. We can calculate some odds based on what we observe in a larger population as a whole, but it's very, very rare for us to point at a particular trait and say, with this gene, you are for sure going to have this IQ or develop this particular disorder. Of all of the different genetic studies, I can think of one instance where we have a deterministic component, and that's actually Huntington's disease, where with Huntington's disease, they've tracked it to a single gene, and at that location, there are a whole bunch of different versions of that gene, and they can be longer or shorter. What's effectively happened is that while making copies of our DNA, there's sometimes a little bit of a slip where you can make copies of something you already copied just because the DNA strands separated and reattached. You don't need to know the mechanism. It's just you end up with a whole bunch of extra copies because something went wrong. And if you are over a certain threshold of copies, I think it's somewhere in the range of like 30 or 35 copies, anything larger than that, and you will develop that disorder. Whereas if you are under that value, you will not. There's a little bit of a gray area in the middle where it's maybe, but it's sort of one of those only traits where we have a yes or no answer. Our next little bit here is looking at a little bit of intelligence across cultures. Then we get into some of our standardizations and things like that. So we get a bunch of stuff clustered together here. But when we look at intelligence across cultures, this is saying things like how would scores in North America compare to scores in Europe or anywhere else in the world? But we've already had some discussions kind of broken up over the rest of the chapter about some of the limitations of a lot of these reports where they're trying to compare intelligence between different countries. Because different groups are going to have different views about what they prioritize in terms of things that should be included in education, if there is a standardized education system, but even just with what you would include in an intelligence test designed for a particular country, it may end up being very, very different than a test designed for some other country, depending on what they prioritize. Is mathematical reasoning super important? If yes, you might get a bunch of those questions. If they'd much rather more abstract, non-number reasoning, you might end up with no math type questions. So there's a lot of variety depending on where all of our tests have originated, but also when we look at the performance. So even if we did have a standardized test, even if we used, say, our our Sanford Binet test is one of the ones I can remember. If we did that everywhere around the world, there'd be a lot of variation between countries, but because that test is probably specialized for North America, we'd end up expecting a lot of those variations to be culturally influenced rather than an actual accurate measure of intelligence differences. So we always take these numbers with sort of that little bit of concern, that little bit of critical thinking. So yeah, different cultures, different views, different conceptualizations of intelligence. And then even if we get into things like language, they have different languages, and so you'd have to change up the wording for each of these. And then if we start thinking about things like, say, turns of phrase, certain phrases would be very, very different in, say, English versus French. I've always found it absolutely ridiculous to look up French phrases and the literal translation versus what they're supposed to be standing in for, and I never know how they came up with those. But if you look critically at English phrases, I'm sure other languages would think the same of us as well. So things like that would absolutely have a role. That also would be concerning for, say, people who speak multiple languages, and maybe they're being tested in what is either not a language they're strong in, or maybe a secondary language versus a primary language. This is something that even with something as simple as designing midterm questions, there are certain common phrases that you might avoid to not have ambiguity for students who might not know those in English. So definitely has to be considered with these tests as well. So yeah, there's a lot of variation here. And this is one of those reasons why, even if you go and, say, find some popular media articles that point to these papers where they found massive differences, where this country is totally smarter than that country, a lot of them, if you go back to it, has pretty strong roots in the tests themselves and how they're delivered and those sorts of limitations. We do see some similarities. So if we look at things like abilities to solve these survival-linked problems. So if we can trace it back to maybe you word things like finding food sources or avoiding predators and things like that, kind of like our naturalistic intelligence from our gardener's proposals. Those tend to be prized regardless of where in the world you are. But that's not necessarily easy to put onto an intelligence test. That would be more like if you talk to different groups and you ask about what an intelligent person might be good at, that would be something a lot of them would talk about. But a lot of this disagreement on what should or shouldn't be included is what makes it so variable and why it's really, really hard to make direct comparisons. I did earlier on in this chapter talk about the Raven matrices, where we had sort of removed from language and removed from verbal components, just looking at patterns in symbols, so just visual, spatial pattern recognition stuff. And that gives us a little bit less bias across cultures, but you still have that potential that familiarity with different shapes. And even if you look at, say, schooling, go back to junior kindergarten, or I don't know if you have JK here, just kindergarten in general. You would have, say, things like put all the circles together, put all the triangles together, and that stressing of categories might help or hinder with some of the problems. And that might not be common to other school systems or to places where they don't have formal schooling systems. So lots and lots of, here's something that might help avoid some bias, but it's also still biased. So we always have to be very considerate in our interpretations. Goodness. All right. So our next little bit, and like I said, this section here hops around quite a lot, but we're starting to get into our standards when we're designing these intelligence tests. So it kind of carries over nicely from our previous slide where we talked about what might be prioritized given the culture that we're in, what might they want to include on these tests, and we can follow up here and look at sort of two aspects of standardization that would be important for intelligence tests, regardless of the types of questions you choose to put on these tests. So one of these is this idea of standardization focused on our development of norms. So this is looking at the data and having some consistent way of interpreting that data. So I've mentioned before that when we design our intelligence tests, we are typically going to have an IQ of 100 as our standard. So this applies for our Stanford Binet as well as the WAIS and WAISC, the ones that we talked about early on as pretty common standards. While the Stanford Binet only ever gives us that one value, the WAIS and WAISC give multiple scores, but I believe you can also sort of combine them into a single score for comparison purposes. All of that is kind of irrelevant in this situation where we're saying the peak of our curve is going to be at 100. We've standardized our questions and our scoring of those questions so that in a given population that this test is designed for, we anticipate the average score to be 100. And because of that standardization, we actually end up with a standard curve or a normal curve where we can predict what proportion of our people who take this test should fall in all of these different clusters along this curve. So about 1% would fall into this category over here. And about 50% are going to fall somewhere between 90 and 110 for their scores. The specific numbers are not super important for us. They're just listed here because this is part of the standardization process for those specific tests. And we've mentioned from that discussion of the Flynn effect that it's this average that's been creeping slowly over time due to a whole bunch of potential background factors. And so what that would mean is that if we wanted to maintain this standardization, we'd have to continually adjust how we interpret and how we collapse the data that we get from those questions, or add new questions that are going to allow us to have this same curve even over time with those adjustments. So that development of norms, once again, we don't tell you how we do that standardization. We just say this is what happens in the background. But it's really important to do that because we're then saying, okay, here's our baseline. Here's what we anticipate. From that, what does our sample look like? Does our sample follow this expected distribution? If so, great. And if not, what makes our sample different? Are we maybe looking at a group who are all coming from a highly funded, science-focused school, and then they're all scoring really high on this test? Does that have something to do with that environment that they're in? So this gives us something to compare back to because this should be our expectations whenever we look at these results. So it just gives us something to interpret a score against, or a group of scores. We also standardize from the side of things of how we deliver the test. So controlled procedures for how people take the test. So things like we might be concerned about, say, order effects. So do we have the test delivered always in the same order, or is it always randomized? Does it matter? Do we have them take the test in the same environment, in the same mode? Does it matter if you take it on the computer versus if you take it on paper? What about if you take it at home versus in a, say, soundproof environment? And you'd want to look at some of those things where, until we know that there isn't a difference between where you take the tests, you'd probably want to control for all of that. You would like to standardize all of that unless you know it's not going to play a role. And even if people have done studies where they say it shouldn't have an effect, you're safer off to still try and do it in as controlled of an environment as possible. So if you've ever taken a standardized achievement or aptitude test, they usually have you go to one of those learning centers where they have a controlled environment and you're not allowed certain things in the room. And it's soundproof with no distractions and everybody has the same computer and all of those things. That's standardization of the procedure of delivering that test. And that allows us to control for other extraneous factors that might be influencing your results. That also then includes, how do the people who interact with you tell you what to do? Are there explicit instructions? Are they able to tell you sort of where to start or what you should be clicking on? Or is it only verbal or only written instructions on the screen? It's kind of neat to look at how this can play a role, because one of the experiments run in the lab I was in, we had a situation where we had participants come in working with people, and we had them listen to our 2 different types of chickadee sounds and put them into different categories. And at the beginning we said, okay, well, you're going to be listening to sounds and you're going to sort them into categories, and you do so by clicking, and then we leave them to their own devices. But we had someone say, well, maybe the way that you're giving that information is giving them an understanding of what's going on. Telling them they're categorizing might give them a idea of something about the experiment. So we ran a subset of our participants with no instructions at all. We just said, you're going to figure it out and you're going to get feedback. And then it also gives us a way to compare to the chickadees, who obviously don't get instructions either. But in that case, giving instructions or not giving instructions, it can have a massive influence on performance. So it could give them a sort of bias in how they respond, especially if it's a very leading statement. And if that's something you're concerned about, you would then have to standardize the type of instructions that can and can't be given. So there's a lot of things you need to consider in that controlling the procedures standardization.